Hey guys, tonight we are trading the roar of the modern world for the ancient whisper of the Emerald Isle. Close your eyes, and you're not in your bedroom anymore. You're trudging through a coastal bog, the cold, damp air thick with the scent of wet peat and salt. Overhead, the moon slices through scudding clouds, illuminating the outline of a rough, circular stone fort. You hear the distant clank of iron on stone and the guttural, rhythmic sound of a language you don't understand. That's Gaelic. You can almost feel the scratchy wool of a chieftain's tunic and see the spiral designs carved into a gold torque around his neck. It's wild, it's beautiful, and here's the reality check. If you were actually there, without your modern comforts, you probably wouldn't survive the week between the tribal feuds and the weather. You'd be better off taking your chances with a slightly damp pillow. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you are right now and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin not with a conquering army, but with the subtle shift of culture. Long before any organized invasion, sometime around 600 BCE, the Celts began to arrive in Ireland. Now, Celtic arrival isn't like a fleet of ships pulling up to a dock. Historians still argue whether it was a slow, steady migration of people or simply the transmission of a vibrant new culture and language across the sea from Britain and the continent. Either way, this island, previously inhabited by Neolithic peoples who left behind spectacular passage tombs like Newgrange, an incredible, quirky tidbit. The central chamber of Newgrange aligns perfectly with the rising sun of the winter solstice. They were serious about astronomy, was about to be utterly transformed. The people adopted the Celtic language, which evolved into Irish Gaelic, and their societal structure embraced the Celtic tribal system. You step into this Iron Age society and find it not ruled by a single king in a towering castle. It's a decentralized patchwork of smaller kingdoms called Tuatha, each led by an elected king, Ear. Think of it like a medieval version of competing local sports leagues, fiercely loyal to their team, always jostling for dominance, but loosely recognizing a regional champion. The law of the land was the Brehon Law, a complex and fascinating legal code administered by learned specialists called Brehons. This law was not based on punishment, but on restitution. You wronged someone. You didn't go to jail. You had to pay a fine, Iriac, often in livestock. You steal a cow. You pay back 2 cows and maybe a few sheep for emotional distress. It's oddly sensible, provided you have enough cattle. Crucially, ruling over the spiritual and intellectual life were the Druids. These weren't just priests. They were the guardians of lore, the judges, the astronomers, and the philosophers of Celtic Ireland. They were the walking, talking databases of an entirely oral tradition. Imagine having to memorize every law, every prophecy, and every story of your people. That's the Druids' job. They held their ceremonies in sacred groves and places of natural power. You would never cross a Druid. They commanded immense respect and fear, often associated with powerful magic and the cycles of life, death, and rebirth. One mainstream historical fact you need to hold on to is that the Druids represented the absolute peak of intellectual authority in pre-Christian Ireland, completely interwoven with the political leadership. When a juror needed advice on war or judgment on a crime, he turned to his druid. It's like having a combination: Supreme Court Justice and Chief Science Officer who can also predict the future. And yes, you probably wouldn't survive a religious dispute with them either. They weren't known for their patience with theological dissenters. The transition from simple farming communities to this complex, layered, and often mystical Celtic structure sets the stage for everything that follows. We've got our tribes, our laws, and our spiritual guides, all waiting for the clash of cultures that's inevitably coming. You're still breathing the damp, earthy air of ancient Ireland, watching that Celtic society gel into something remarkably complex. We move forward into what historians call the Iron Age, a time defined not by unity, but by the intense rivalry of regional powers. Remember those Tuatha, the local sports teams? Well, they belonged to larger provinces, the legendary 5/5 of Ireland Dúlaid Ulster. Lagan, Leinster, Mummin, Munster, Coist, all neckmacked Connaught, though its borders shifted, and the central kingdom of Meath, which often acted as a buffer or a battleground. This is a mainstream historical fact. The provincial structure, though fluid, defined Irish politics for centuries. You see how the land itself dictates the power struggles. You're walking through a world constantly carved up by shifting alliances, cattle raids known as Crek, and a deep-seated culture of martial prowess. To survive, you needed to be good at two things: fighting and poetry, maybe not in that order. Now, let's talk about the big league champion, the High King of Ireland, Ard Urge, Éireann. Theoretically, the Ard Urge was the supreme ruler, a figure of national authority residing at the mythical center of the island's political and spiritual life, the Hill of Tara in County Meath. You stand on Tara today, and the rolling green landscape seems to stretch forever. It's not a castle, but a series of ancient earthworks and mounds, a place drenched in ritual and memory. But here's the quirky tidbit: the position of High King was never truly hereditary or fully secure. It wasn't like a crown passing smoothly from father to son. Instead, it was an elected position, often contested through warfare or political maneuvering. Sometimes, you had a powerful High King who genuinely controlled the island. Other times, the title was little more than a prestigious claim used to get a better seat at a feast. Historians still argue whether the High Kingship was a truly functional office before the 10th century, or primarily a ceremonial, aspirational title reflecting an ideal unity. It's the difference between being captain of the world and simply having a nice captain's hat. The law and the social structure of this age were bound by a strict hierarchy. Below the kings, you had the nobles, Erig, the freeman Fenny, and at the bottom, the unfree. Your entire identity, your worth in the eyes of the Brehon law, was determined by your inherited status and how much property red cattle you owned. For a society that valued oral tradition so highly, the Fili the poets and seers held extraordinary power, often ranking just below the kings and druids. They could sing you into fame or, terrifyingly, curse you to ignominy with a stinging satire glm descent. It was a social system where having a good voice was almost as important as having a good sword. Which makes you wonder if anyone ever tried to fight a duel using only strongly worded limericks. I'd pay to see that. You have to imagine the daily life, small, circular houses of wattle and daub surrounding a central ring fort RTH or Dwin, primarily focused on herding cattle, which were the ultimate currency. If you wanted to get married, pay a fine, or buy land, it was calculated in cattle. This obsession with livestock fueled the constant cattle raiding, the ancient equivalent of stealing your neighbor's expensive sports car. It was seen less as a crime and more as a demonstration of strength and daring, a rite of passage for young warriors. This political and social landscape, with its fractured power and pagan rituals, is where the next major force will land, a force that promises not better land or more cattle, but eternal salvation. The world of the Druids and the Ardret Etera is about to collide head-on with a new religion carried by a figure we still talk about today. You remember that complex societal structure based on cattle and Brehon law. Keep that firmly in mind, because it's about to be overlaid with crosses and Latin texts. The wind has picked up, and you can practically feel the scratch of homespun linen against your skin as a dramatic figure steps onto the stage of Irish history, St. Patrick. His arrival in the mid-5th century is a pivotal moment, a tectonic shift from the age of the Druids to the age of the monks. But here's the twist. Patrick was a powerful Roman envoy sent on a grand mission of conquest. He arrived first as a slave. When he was just 16, Irish pirates raided his family's Romanized British home, dragged him across the sea, and forced him to herd sheep in the bleak, wet hills of County Antrim. This cruel, solitary 6-year servitude, the ultimate test of characters, what forged the man. It's a mainstream historical fact that this period of isolation led to his profound religious conversion. He prayed hundreds of times a day, finding solace in the Christian God he had previously only paid lip service to. After escaping and eventually making his way back to Britain, Patrick had a famous vision. A man named Victorious handed him countless letters, and in one, he heard the voice of the Irish calling him back. Imagine the emotional whiplash, returning voluntarily to the place of your greatest trauma, not for revenge, but for salvation. He trained as a cleric and returned to Ireland around 430 to CE, sent as a bishop to minister to the small existing Christian communities and to spread the gospel to the pagan tribes. You picture him, not in a velvet robe, but in simple traveler's clothes, facing down kings and druids, wielding nothing but his faith and his knowledge of the local tongue, which he'd learned as a slave. His missionary strategy was genius in its cultural sensitivity. Rather than wiping the slate clean, he wove Christian practice into the existing Celtic fabric. The most famous example, of course, is the shamrock. The quirky tidbit here is the legend that he used the 3-leafed clover to clearly illustrate the concept of the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, a singular deity with 3 aspects. For a people whose mythology was filled with powerful triple goddesses and tripartite forms, this visual shorthand was incredibly effective. He also took the powerful Celtic sun symbol and superimposed it onto the Christian cross, creating the distinctive Celtic cross we know today, subtly merging the new faith with symbols already revered by the people. This was a conversion by compromise, not conquest. Crucially, his mission took direct aim at the spiritual authority you remember from Section 1, the Druids. Legends abound of Patrick engaging in magical duels with the high priests of the Ardiat Terra, outperforming their magic with Christian miracles. He was often met with violence and resistance, yet he persisted, converting entire family units and setting up early churches and monasteries across the island. His success was instantaneous. Christianity took centuries to fully permeate all corners of Irish society, but his personal bravery and direct approach were revolutionary. And what about the snakes? That's the big Shamzan salvation question. You probably know the famous tale of Patrick standing on a hilltop, staff raised, driving all the serpents off the island and into the sea. This brings us to a major scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the snake story is a literal claim or a powerful metaphor. The scientific fact is that Ireland, due to the last ice age and the fact that it was disconnected from Britain by water before snakes could migrate, never actually had native snakes. Therefore, many scholars see the snakes as symbolic, representing the pagan religion, the Druids, or simply the evil of sin that Patrick banished from the island's spiritual life. It's a perfect piece of propaganda, turning a geological reality into a divine miracle. Regardless of the reptile reality, Patrick left behind a spiritual landscape utterly changed, paving the way for the golden age of Irish learning that was about to dawn. He died around 461 CE, having permanently altered the trajectory of the island. And the stage is now set for the next chapter, the rise of the monasteries. You feel the transition now, the chill of the Iron Age pagan world yielding to the calm, echoing stone of the early Christian era. The conversion Patrick initiated wasn't a flash flood. It was a slow, deliberate drip, 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 and its enduring monuments are the monasteries. As continental Europe descended into the chaos of the Dark Ages following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, Ireland, relatively isolated and never fully integrated into Rome's domain, entered its own unexpected period of brilliance, the Golden Age of monasticism. This is a mainstream historical fact. Between the 6th and 9th centuries, while much of Europe was in disarray, Irish monasteries became the supreme centers of learning, art, and civilization in the West. You wander through one of these monastic settlements, perhaps Clonmacnoise, on the River Shannon. It's not one massive church, but a complex of small, round, wattle-and-daub cells. A larger stone church, a graveyard dotted with highly decorated high crosses, and a tall, sturdy round tower. We'll come back to the round tower. These monasteries, unlike the centralized diocese of Rome, were independent spiritual cities, often under the authority of a powerful abbot Erkinach, who was frequently related to the local royal family. The structure of the church adapted to the existing political reality. The local power structures you remember from Section 2, the Tuatha, now sponsored and protected their own powerful monasteries. It was a fusion of the spiritual and the tribal. The heart of this golden age was the scriptorium, the writing room. Imagine a silent, cold room where dedicated monks labored by the light of a single window, carefully scraping vellum calfskin and copying texts. Not just religious texts, but the classics of Greek and Latin literature that had been lost or forgotten in the turmoil of the continent. Irish monks saw it as their sacred duty to preserve knowledge. They didn't just copy, they illuminated. They created breathtaking masterpieces like the Book of Kells, which you can still gaze at Tadon's incredibly ornate gospel book, decorated with swirling Celtic knots and intricate figures, a vibrant fusion of Christian text and native art styles. This commitment to the written word is why Ireland earned the moniker the Island of Saints and Scholars. The power of these monasteries soon extended beyond Ireland's shores, fueled by a particularly fervent desire for spiritual exile, peregrinatio pro Christo. Irish monks became intrepid missionaries, sailing in small leather boats, correx, across the sea. You follow in the footsteps of figures like Saint Columba, who founded the pivotal monastery of Iona in Scotland, and Saint Columbanus, who traveled deep into the European mainland, founding influential monasteries in France, Germany, Switzerland, and Italy. This is the ultimate quirky tidbit. These Irish monks helped reintroduce literacy, religious structure, and classical texts back into a fractured Europe, essentially acting as the intellectual life support system for the continent. However, life wasn't all quiet scholarship and missionary zeal. These monastic centers were also repositories of great wealth, gold, silver, fine craftsmanship, and they held vast tracts of land. This prosperity, ironically, made them highly visible and attractive targets. The round towers, remember them. They were primarily bell towers, but they served another vital function. Historians still argue whether their primary purpose was for defense against human attack, storage of valuables, or simply as bell towers for announcing services. But given their sturdy, often windowless stone structure and elevated entrances, accessible only by ladder, they were certainly utilized as places of refuge for monks and their most precious relics and manuscripts when danger approached, and danger was coming. You can sense the shift in the air, the coastal fog carrying a new, ominous scent, salt, sweat, and the sharp temps of burnt wood. This peaceful, learned Christian kingdom, decentralized and wealthy, was about to meet its first major external challenge since Patrick's time. The seas that had brought scholars and saints were about to bring something entirely different. Long, fast ships carrying heavily armed raiders with names like Ostman and Dubgill. The era of gentle evangelism is closing, and the age of the Viking axe is about to begin. The wealth stored in those quiet scriptoriums, copied so diligently from the lost libraries of Rome, is about to be violently catalogued by a new wave of brutal invaders. The serenity of the Golden Age, those quiet scriptoriums you were just imagining, is about to be shattered. You're standing on the coast, perhaps near what will one day be Dublin, and the peaceful lapping of the waves is abruptly overwhelmed by a new sound. The rhythmic splash of dozens of oars and the terrifying roar of men speaking in a harsh, guttural language, Old Norse. Sometime in the late 8th century, around 795 CE, the Vikings arrived. They weren't coming to trade. They came to pillage. Their initial targets were perfectly chosen, the wealthy, undefended, and pacifist centers of Irish life, the monasteries. Remember those beautiful golden chalices and intricately bound books the monks worked so hard to create? To the Norse raiders, those weren't priceless artifacts of faith. They were simply raw material to be melted down into profit. Their longships, or drekker, were fast, shallow-drafted vessels, allowing them to strike deep inland via the rivers and then vanish back out to sea before any organized defense could be mounted. The early raids were devastating hit-and-run attacks. Monasteries like Iona, Kildare, and the great center of Clonmacnoise, which you walked through just a moment ago, were attacked multiple times. The monks, trained in prayer and scholarship, were ill-equipped to defend themselves. One mainstream historical fact is that the Irish annals, the monks' own records of events, begin to shift their focus dramatically during this period, moving from gentle hagiographies to stark, terrified accounts of fierce, hostile pagans coming from the sea. You can almost hear the frantic ringing of the bell towers, the signal for the monks to scramble into those tall, slender, round towers you recall, dragging their treasures with them. However, the Vikings were more than just raiders. They were eventually settlers. By the mid-9th century, they stopped merely sailing away with their loot and began establishing permanent, fortified coastal bases called longforts, from the Irish long meaning ship and port meaning haven. This marks the beginning of Ireland's urban history. Instead of living in scattered tribal ring forts, you now see the Norse establishing the island's first towns: Dublin, Blackpool, Waterford, Wexford, Limerick, and Cork. These towns, clustered around the ports, became powerful economic hubs, dominating trade in slaves, timber, and silver. They introduced international coin-based currency, transforming the ancient cattle-based economy you remember from the early Celtic period into a mercantile one. This led to a new political reality. The centuries of Celtic tribal feuding were now overlaid with a third party, the Ostman Norsemen living in Ireland. The old Irish kings, the Irish, had the Norse invaders endlessly, or hired them as mercenaries to fight their Irish rivals. Often they chose the latter, leading to incredibly complex and opportunistic alliances. You find yourself in a world where a Gaelic king from Munster might be allied with the Norse king of Dublin to fight a Gaelic king from Leinster. It's a messy, pragmatic, and bloody game of medieval power politics. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Vikings were instrumental in introducing things the Irish had previously lacked, including large-scale shipbuilding and, surprisingly, chess. While the Irish played a form of board game, the strategic game of chess is believed to have been popularized through the Norse trade routes, a slightly more intellectual pastime than the traditional cattle raids. They brought not just axes and destruction, but also organization and international connectivity. The impact on Gaelic culture was profound. The Norse threat, ironically, created a sense of shared Irish identity and opposition that the decentralized tribal structure had previously prevented. Historians still argue whether the Viking incursions ultimately weakened or strengthened the centralized high kingship. But there is no doubt that the necessity of mounting large-scale campaigns against the foreigners began to vest greater power and prestige in a few dominant regional Irish families. It's like a massive external threat forcing dozens of small, squabbling companies to finally agree on a single CEO. This is the stage upon which a true Irish hero is about to emerge, a man who will take advantage of this forced unity to challenge the Norse dominance and lay claim to the one title that truly mattered: Ard Erd Erin. You hear the sound of the hammers now, not just building longships, but forging a resistance. The longships and the scent of salt have dominated the air for over 2 centuries. But now the balance of power is about to shift violently, propelled by the ambition of one man. You recall how the Vikings settled in those coastal longforts, Dublin, Waterford, Limerick, and how the native Irish kings began fighting alongside them or against them, depending on the day. This political chaos, where tribal kings vied for the title of Ardor while simultaneously battling the Norse, sets the stage for the towering figure of Brian Baruma Mac Seneteg. Brian wasn't born into the high kingship. He was a king of Munster, part of the D.L. Gacy sept, a family previously overshadowed by the powerful Eoganashta dynasty. His rise is one of relentless, calculated ambition and military genius. The Viking raids had brutally demonstrated the weakness of the old, fragmented Irish system. Brian learned from his enemies, building his power base not just on tradition and law, like the Brehon Law, you remember, but on a professional, well-equipped army and a strong naval fleet on the river Shannon. He used the Vikings' own tactics against them and, crucially, unified the squabbling local kings by forcing them to accept his dominance. He systematically defeated rival Munster kings and, by 976 CE, became King of Munster. His sights were set higher. Over the next few decades, you watch Brian expand his influence, conquering Leinster and eventually challenging the sitting High King, Mael Secnail II. In 1002, Brian finally deposed Mael Secnail and claimed the title of High King of Ireland. Now, a mainstream historical fact you must grasp. Brian Boru was arguably the first genuinely effective High King, controlling not just the ceremonial aspects from the Hill of Tara, but exacting tribute, borima, and commanding loyalty across the island. He ushered in a brief period of peace and relative prosperity, rebuilding churches and roads that the Norse raids had devastated. He even brought a measure of stability to the church, which had been corrupted by abbots concerned more with land and power than piety. Brian's reign was a clear moment when the idea of a unified Irish nation under a single, strong ruler moved from myth to reality. But the peace was fragile. The Norse-Irish of Dublin, led by their king, Sigtryg, and their allies, the rebellious king of Leinster, Mael Morda Mac Merchada, could not abide the D.L. Gacy rule. They saw Brian as an upstart who threatened their commercial wealth and independence. They secured powerful allies from overseas, notably from the Isle of Man and the Orkneys, forming a formidable coalition determined to break Brian's power. The simmering tensions came to a violent, definitive head on Good Friday, April 23, 1014, the Battle of Clontarf. You can picture the scene, the field just north of Dublin, packed with thousands of shouting, fighting Mengals, fighting Gaels, Norse fighting Gaels, and even Norse fighting alongside Gaels. The battle itself was a brutal, full-day affair, a cacophony of axes, swords, and war cries. It was a massive, bloody, tactical victory for Brian's forces. They completely routed the combined forces of Leinster and the Norse, breaking the Viking dominance in Ireland forever. The Norse threat was neutralized. They would remain in their coastal towns, but their military and political power was permanently crippled. Here's the poignant, quirky tidbit. Brian Boru himself, despite the victory, did not survive. At 73 years old, he refused to fight, spending the battle in his tent, praying. After the rout, a fleeing Norse chieftain named Broder of Man stumbled upon the tent and murdered the unarmed High King. Brian's death immediately complicated the succession, turning the victory into a hollow political tragedy. The great debate phrase for this pivotal moment is that historians still argue whether Clontarf was truly a battle for Irish unity against foreign invaders, or merely the biggest of the many ongoing feuds between Irish regional kings, with the Vikings simply being used as powerful high-stakes mercenaries by the losing side, Leinster. Regardless of the motivation, the result was decisive. The Norse power was broken. However, Brian's death created a power vacuum, as he lacked a clear, universally accepted successor. The title of Ard reverted back to the weaker hands of male Secnail II for a few years. But the dream of a unified Ireland, momentarily achieved, now fractured, leading to a new age of internal squabbling. The High Kingship became little more than a title to be taken by force, not a symbol of national unity, setting the stage for even deeper political instability. The roar of the victory at Clontarf has faded, and you find yourself in the devastating aftermath of political collapse. Remember the monumental achievement of Brian Boru in Section 6, the first figure to nearly unify Ireland under one strong hand. His dramatic death on the field of his greatest triumph meant that the centralized authority he had built rested entirely on his personal power and military prestige. With Brian gone, the fledgling unity crumbled immediately. You are plunged back into a messy, multi-layered power vacuum. A century and a half of intense internal rivalry known as the period of fragmented kingship, or Ireland without a high king with opposition, a common and telling term used by the annalists. The High Kingship of Ireland, Ard Éireann, became a title to be seized, not inherited, and no single dynasty could hold on to it securely for long. This is a mainstream historical fact. The 11th and 12th centuries were defined by a succession of powerful provincial kings, such as the Y. Brian of Munster, the Y. Concobar of Connaught, and the Mac Loch Lane of the Senil Neogain in Ulster, who fought viciously among themselves for the title. These men were known as High Kings with opposition, meaning their claim was disputed, and their authority never recognized across the entire island. You watch as they spend more time and resources battling each other than consolidating the nation, often using the now subdued Norse Irish from the coastal towns like Dublin as tactical pawns and mercenaries in their internal feuds. The political landscape returned to the complex web of shifting alliances and betrayals that Brian Boru had momentarily suppressed. Kingship was a high-stakes, ruthless game. To survive, you had to constantly raid your neighbors for cattle and hostages, destroy their fortresses, and marry your daughters strategically. You could go from being the most powerful king in Ireland one year to being blinded or exiled the next. It was a chaotic, decentralized system where regional interest always trumped national unity. Yet, despite this political fragmentation, Gaelic Irish society itself remained robust and culturally distinct. The monasteries, which you recall as the centers of learning, continued to function, albeit often entangled in the political struggles. The Brehon law system still held sway across most of the island, regulating everything from property disputes to royal succession, keeping a stable legal foundation beneath the political turmoil. This era also saw a movement of internal reform within the Irish Church culminating in the Synod of Kells in 1152, which attempted to bring the decentralized, monastic-centric Irish Church more in line with the organized diocesan structure of the Roman Church. This attempt at internal order, ironically, came just decades before external forces would completely overwhelm the island's political independence. Here's a quirky tidbit. The most powerful of the later High Kings, Ruaidhri, Ua Concaber of Connaught, attempted to secure his position by expelling the Norse Irish from Dublin in 1171, demonstrating the continued presence and occasional menace of that Viking legacy, which you remember from Section 5. He was an impressive figure, but his authority was ultimately too weak and too late to prevent the catastrophe looming on the horizon. This era of Gaelic squabbling is absolutely crucial because it created the fatal weakness that the next invaders would exploit. The Irish kings, so preoccupied with being the Ard Reed that they failed to be a king, never truly learned to unite against a common existential threat. Historians still argue whether a different outcome at Clontarf if Brian Boru had lived and consolidated a true monarchy, would have prevented the coming foreign invasion. What is clear is that a desperate, feuding Irish king, facing a crisis of his own making, would soon turn to a powerful foreign lord for help, a decision that would unravel centuries of Gaelic independence. You feel the atmosphere change again, from internal strife to the sense of a door being left unlocked. The long, meandering road of native Irish rule is about to hit a sudden, violent detour. The political landscape you're surveying is a house divided, a nation of feuding kings ripe for foreign intervention. Remember how the powerful high kings, like Ruaidhri Ua Concaber, the one who failed to achieve lasting unity, as discussed in Section 7, were locked in ceaseless squabbles. This internal strife would soon provide the catastrophic opening for the English. Our story now focuses on one Irish king whose desperation would forever change the island. Dermot MacMurrough, Dermot MacMurchada, King of Leinster. Dermot was a ruthless, ambitious, and deeply unpopular ruler. In 1166, he committed an act of spectacular medieval audacity. He abducted Dervergilla, the wife of his rival Tiernan O'Rourke, King of Brife. This was far more than a personal scandal. It was a profound political and legal insult that violated the Brehon law, the complex legal system you learned about in Section 1 and 7. Tiernan O'Rourke gathered a formidable coalition, including the High King Ruaidhri Ua Concaber, and they successfully drove Dermot from his kingdom of Leinster in 1166. You can picture Dermot as a desperate man, stripped of his power, his lands, and his status, exiled from his homeland. Instead of accepting defeat or turning to another Irish king who mostly hated him anyway, Dermot did the unthinkable. He sailed across the Irish Sea to seek aid from the Angevins, the mighty Norman dynasty that ruled England and vast swaths of France. This is the pivotal moment, a mainstream historical fact that marks the end of an era. He sought out King Henry II of England, one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. Henry, preoccupied with continental troubles and his notorious conflict with Thomas Becket, didn't offer direct military aid, but he did grant Dermot something crucial: permission to recruit soldiers from among Henry's vassals. Dermot MacMurrough now focused his efforts on the Norman Lords of Wales, a group of restless, militarily formidable adventurers known for their ruthlessness and ambition. The man who answered Dermot's call most eagerly was Richard de Clare, 2nd Earl of Pembroke, better known to history by his intimidating nickname, Strongbow. Richard Fitzgilbert de Clare. Strongbow saw an opportunity for immense personal gain, a chance to carve out a new kingdom for himself in Ireland, away from Henry II's watchful eye. The deal was simple. Strongbow would bring a large military force to Ireland, and in return he would receive Dermot's daughter, Eva, in marriage, and, crucially, the succession to the entire kingdom of Leinster upon Dermot's death. This agreement, formalized in Bristol, transformed a local Irish feud into an international crisis. The Norman incursion began in earnest in 1169. Small advance forces landed first, securing Wexford and paving the way. But the main event was the arrival of Strongbow himself near Waterford in August 1170, with a force of knights, archers, and foot soldiers. You can imagine the sight: disciplined, armored cavalry facing the relatively lightly armed, tribal Irish fighters. The Normans brought superior military technology, chainmail, crossbows, and, most importantly, the ability to build sturdy motte-and-bailey castles quickly, a tactical advantage the Irish kings had never fully developed. The immediate impact was devastating. The Normans, fighting with a unity and discipline the fractured Irish forces lacked, quickly captured the Norse-Irish towns of Waterford, and soon after, the key prize, Dublin. Strongbow married Aoife in Waterford amidst the chaos, cementing his legal claim to Leinster. The Irish kings, led by Ruaidhri Uaid Conchobar, finally realized the severity of the threat, but their efforts to unite and expel the invaders were disorganized and too late. Here is the quirky tidbit that demonstrates the cultural chasm. When the Normans were besieging Dublin, the Irish forces surrounding the town were not unified. The Irish were fighting according to their own seasonal tribal rules, which often included truces for religious holidays or harvest. The Normans, however, were professional, brutal mercenaries who fought year-round. They used this naive Irish adherence to traditional fighting etiquette to their immense advantage, resulting in devastating surprise attacks. The success of Dermot and Strongbow became too much for King Henry II to ignore. His vassal, Strongbow, was carving out an entire kingdom and acting independently, a direct challenge to the Angevin crown. Historians still argue whether Henry II's primary motive for his next move was to assert his feudal lordship over Strongbow, or if it was the desire to seize the entire island, bolstered by a controversial papal bull. Regardless, the invasion had begun, and the greatest king in the Western world was about to arrive on Irish shores to claim his prize, setting the stage for centuries of English rule. The sound of Norman war drums is now echoing across the island. But the final authority for the conquest came not from a soldier, but from a pope. You just witnessed the catastrophic success of Strongbow's Landing Section 8, which saw the Norman Welsh mercenaries seize control of critical coastal towns and the Kingdom of Leinster. This spectacular, unauthorized success, however, immediately alarmed Strongbow's distant overlord, King Henry II of England. Henry feared that Strongbow would establish an entirely independent, rival Norman kingdom just across the sea, a geopolitical nightmare. Henry II, the powerful Angevin ruler, acted decisively. In October 1171, less than a year after Strongbow's major victories, Henry landed near Waterford with a massive fleet and a large, well-equipped army, a mainstream historical fact that marks the first direct intervention of the English crown in Ireland. You can picture the sheer contrast. The previous forces were mercenary adventurers. This was the supreme monarch of Britain and half of France, arriving to assert his authority. Strongbow immediately submitted to his king, relinquishing control of the Norse towns he had conquered, including Dublin. In exchange, Henry confirmed Strongbow as Lord of Leinster, but only as a feudal vassal of the English crown. This act effectively transformed the private Norman invasion into an official English royal claim over Irish territory. Henry, too, didn't stop there. He traveled to Dublin, where the remaining Gaelic Irish kings, including the beleaguered High King Ruaidhri Ua Conchobar, who you remember from Section 7 was struggling to hold things together, quickly submitted to him. They saw Henry not as a greater threat than Strongbow, but as a potential ally who could curb the aggression of the Norman adventurers. You watch as they pay homage, recognizing him as their new overlord, a desperate attempt to salvage their power and preserve the Brehon law system. This quick, relatively bloodless series of submissions allowed Henry to claim the title of Lord of Ireland Dominus Hibernia, not a king, but an overlord which would be used by English monarchs for centuries. But the real authority Henry brought wasn't entirely military. It was, surprisingly, spiritual. This brings us to the papal bull Laudabiliter. Here's a quirky tidbit. This document, allegedly issued by Pope Adrian IV, the only English pope in history back in 1155, supposedly granted Henry II the right to invade Ireland. The reasoning was that the Irish Church, despite its monastic Golden Age Section 4, and recent reform efforts, Synod of Kells, Section 7, was still deemed too decentralized and backward by the standards of the reformist Roman Church. The bull allegedly commanded Henry to enter Ireland to reform the church and ensure the people paid their due tithes to Rome, all while holding the island in fief from the papacy. The controversy surrounding this document is massive. Historians still argue whether Laudabiliter was genuine or a clever forgery created later by Henry's administrators to legitimize the invasion retroactively. What is undeniable is that its existence, and Henry's strategic use of it, provided a moral and religious justification for the English presence in Ireland. It transformed the greedy act of conquest into a sacred mission of civilizing the barbarous, Irisha, dangerous ideology that would fuel future brutality. Henry II returned to England in 1172, leaving the Normans to solidify their gains. The Treaty of Windsor in 1175 attempted to define the boundaries of power. Henry was recognized as Lord of Ireland. The Gaelic kings kept their traditional lands outside the Norman-controlled areas, and Ruaidhri Ua Conchobar was supposed to rule the remaining Gaelic territories as Henry's vassal. You might think this established a stable boundary, but the feudal appetite of the Norman barons, now firmly entrenched in the eastern part of the island, was insatiable. They continued to carve out new lordships, building those signature stone castles, effectively ignoring any treaty, ensuring that the conflict would never cease. The groundwork for a permanent foreign colonial presence had been laid, backed by both the sword and the supposed authority of the Church. The submission of the Gaelic kings to Henry II in 1171 which you observed in the last section, was supposed to bring peace. Instead, it merely formalized the division of Ireland into two intensely opposed spheres. As the Norman lordsmen like Strongbow and the many others who followed him pushed westward, they solidified their control over the eastern and southeastern coastal plains. This core region, centered around Dublin, became known as the Pale NFL. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Pale was a fortified English enclave defined by a physical or conceptual boundary, beyond which English law and culture largely ceased to function. You stand on the edge of the Pale, feeling the stark difference. Inside this zone, you find familiar Norman institutions, feudalism, the establishment of shires, the dominance of English common law, and the construction of massive stone castles, the antithesis of the ephemeral motte and bailey structures the Normans first built. Dublin Castle became the administrative, military, and judicial center of the English lordship. The descendants of the original Norman invaders spoke French or English and considered themselves the civilizing force, importing their language, architecture, and agricultural methods. They were the colonizers, but outside the Pale lay the vast, often impenetrable wilderness known as Beyond the Pale, a phrase that survives in modern English to denote something unacceptable. This was Gaelic Ireland get Haltucht, where the native Irish kings, lords, and chieftains still held sway. You would find that the Brehon law system, which you remember from the early Celtic era, remained the governing legal code, and the Irish language Gaelic and native customs persisted strongly. The political model here remained the fractured, decentralized, tribal one, but now it was united by a shared opposition to the foreign presence. For a time, the Normans were incredibly successful, controlling about 2/3 of the island by the late 13th century. However, their overreach, combined with a series of external and internal crises, led to a dramatic and sustained reversal known as the Gaelic Resurgence, or Gaelic Revival. The Normans had a fatal flaw. They started going native. As the English crown struggled with the crises of the 14th century, the disastrous Great Famine of 1315-1317, the arrival of the Black Death, 1348 to 1350, which disproportionately devastated the crowded Norman towns, and the constant drain of men and money for wars against Scotland and France. London's control over Ireland waned. The Norman lords in Ireland, cut off from England, began to adopt the successful survival strategies of the native Irish. They started intermarrying with Gaelic families, sponsoring Irish poets and historians, adopting the Gaelic language, wearing Irish clothes, and, most crucially, embracing the Brehon law instead of the cumbersome, distant English common law. They became, in the famous phrase, more Irish than the Irish themselves, hibernesis, ipsis, hibernures. Here, a quirky tidbit. One of the most prominent examples of this assimilation was the powerful Burke family, originally de Burgh, who abandoned English customs and became an almost entirely Gaelicized clan, fiercely independent of Dublin and London. They were the ultimate proof that Ireland possessed a powerful, enduring cultural gravity. This period of assimilation and political decay in the English lordship allowed the Gaelic Irish families to recover their lost lands and re-establish powerful lordships deep into areas once controlled by the Normans. The Pale physically shrank to a small, insecure strip of land around Dublin, defended by a fortified ditch and earthwork. Historians still argue whether the Gaelic resurgence of the 14th and 15th centuries was a genuine cultural and political recovery, or simply the English administration's temporary lack of interest due to more pressing European wars. Regardless, the English crown viewed this loss of territory and culture as a serious existential threat to their claim on the entire island. You can sense the crown's alarm their colony was melting away. This fear of cultural absorption would lead to a desperate legislative attempt to draw a hard line between the two peoples, defining exactly who was in and who was beyond the pale. The alarm bells are deafening in the ears of the English crown. You just witnessed the humiliating shrinkage of the pale and the increasing tendency of the Anglo-Norman lords to become more Irish than the Irish themselves. Section 10. By the mid-14th century, the English lordship in Ireland was on the brink of collapse, threatened not by a massive military defeat, but by the quiet, persuasive power of Gaelic culture. The Crown's response was one of desperate cultural entrenchment, resulting in one of the most famously draconian laws in Irish history, the Statutes of Kilkenny of 1366. You're now transported to Kilkenny, where Lionel of Antwerp, the Duke of Clarence and son of King Edward III, presided over the Irish Parliament. The Assembly passed a staggering 70 chapters of legislation designed to prevent the complete cultural assimilation of the English colonists. This is a mainstream historical fact. The entire purpose of the statutes was to draw an unbreachable cultural wall between the people within the Pale and the people beyond it. Imagine the sheer panic that inspired this list of prohibitions. The statutes made it illegal for those of English descent to speak the Irish language Gaelic. They had to use English, or, at least, French. It was forbidden to adopt Irish customs, wear Irish clothing, or ride bareback without a saddle, the Irish style. Crucially, it was illegal to use the Brehon law system, the sophisticated native legal code, UVA, heard about in any dispute involving English settlers. The colonists were strictly commanded to follow English common law. Furthermore, the statutes explicitly forbade the practice of Gaelic fosterage, sending children to be raised in Irish families, and intermarriage between English settlers and the native Irish. The logic was chillingly simple. If the families didn't mix, the cultures couldn't merge. If a colonist was found violating these laws, say, sporting a magnificent Irish mustache, or speaking Gaelic with a local chieftain, they were considered a traitor, and their lands and possessions could be seized. The law even banned the native Irish from holding positions in cathedrals, joining religious orders within the Pale, or attending English schools. It was, in essence, an attempt to legally quarantine an entire culture. The impact of the statutes was profound, yet paradoxical. They failed spectacularly to halt the assimilation process outside the immediate region of Dublin. The Duke of Clarence lacked the military and administrative power to enforce them across the entire island, especially in the great lordships where the Anglo-Norman families had already fully embraced Gaelic customs. The statute only really served to harden the boundary of the Pale itself, cementing the idea of a racial and cultural division within the island. Here's a quirky tidbit. The ban on playing the uniquely Irish game of hurling was included in the statutes. The English administrators feared that the colonists were spending too much time playing this fast, tribal game with the locals, and neglecting the English pastime of archery practices skill essential for the Crown's military defense. Even sport was seen as a political threat. The failure of the statutes to prevent the Gaelic resurgence, coupled with the ongoing weakness of the English monarchy during the Wars of the Roses in the 15th century, created a situation where the lordship of Ireland became almost entirely autonomous and largely Gaelicized, ruled by powerful, locally focused orals, particularly the Geraldines Fitzgeralds of Kildare and Desmond. For over a century, the Pales survived only because of the military might of the Earl of Kildare, who was usually also the king's deputy or viceroy. This Irish-based power was far more effective than any distant English king. This situation leads directly to a vital scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the Statutes of Kilkenny represent the beginning of the deliberate colonial oppression that defines later Irish history, or if they were merely a reactionary defensive measure taken by a terrified, failing administration trying to maintain a sliver of English identity in a hostile, culturally overwhelming environment. Regardless of the intent, the statutes established the legal precedent for defining the English presence in Ireland by excluding the native Irish, paving the way for the totalizing conquest campaigns of the Tudor dynasty. The stage is set for a monarchy that would finally possess the resources and the will to stop the slide into Gaelic chaos. The cultural walls put up by the Statutes of Kilkenny Section 11 proved to be flimsy fences, constantly breached by the enduring force of Gaelic life. By the early 16th century, the English hold on Ireland was an embarrassing Jokatani. Besieged Pale, ruled mostly by the semi-Gaelicized Geraldines of Kildare, who often ignored London's commands. This chaotic situation, however, was about to meet the overwhelming force of the Tudor monarchy, a dynasty defined by centralizing power and ruthless efficiency. The narrative now shifts dramatically from local feuds to imperial policy, driven by two key forces, ambition and religion. The pivotal figure is Henry VIII, preoccupied with his domestic affairs and the monumental upheaval of the English Reformation. Henry initially tried to govern Ireland on the cheap through the powerful Earl of Kildare, but in 1534, a rebellion led by Silken Thomas Fitzgerald, the son of the Earl of Kildare, finally convinced Henry that a policy of absentee rule was a failure. The only way to secure Ireland was through direct control and total conquest. This is a mainstream historical fact. Henry VIII launched the first concerted, state-sponsored campaign to bring the entire island under the absolute control of the English crown. The major legal milestone came in 1541, when Henry VIII declared himself King of Ireland via an act of the Irish Parliament, replacing the centuries-old weaker title of Lord of Ireland, which you remember Henry II had claimed in Section 9. This declaration was not just a name change. It was a unilateral claim of sovereignty over all the Irish people and all their lands, including those held by the most powerful Gaelic chieftains. Henry then launched the policy of surrender and regrant. Under this policy, Gaelic lords were encouraged to surrender their traditional titles and lands to the crown. In return, the lands and an English title, like Earl or Baron, would be regranted back to them under English law. This policy was an ingenious, non-military attempt to replace the fluid, communal Gaelic system of land tenure Brehon law with the strict, hereditary, feudal system of England. It was a formal invitation to exchange the old ways for the king's peace and, more importantly, the king's law. However, the ambitions of the Tudors collided with the seismic shock of the Protestant Reformation. Henry VIII's split from Rome and the subsequent establishment of the Church of Ireland created an unbridgeable religious gulf. While Henry enforced the Reformation inside the small pale the vast majority of the Gaelic Irish and the Old English, the descendants of the original Normans, like the Fitzgeralds, remained staunchly Roman Catholic. You can picture the difference in the atmosphere. One side sees the king as the supreme head of the church, while the other sees him as a dangerous heretic. This religious division transformed the political conflict into a holy war, giving the Irish resistance a profound spiritual justification. The Gaelic chieftains, who refused surrender and regrant, did so not only to protect their independence, but also to defend their faith. Here, as a quirky tidbit, the method used to suppress Silken Thomas's rebellion through the ruthless efficiency of Henry VIII's chief minister. Thomas Cromwell demonstrated a cold, calculating brutality the Irish kings had rarely seen. Silken Thomas and 5 of his uncles were all captured under truce and executed in London, signaling that the rules of war had changed. Feudal loyalty meant nothing to the new imperial state. This religious factor provides the core of the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the Tudor conquest was primarily motivated by state security, preventing Ireland from being used as a base for Catholic enemies like Spain or France, or by genuine religious zeal. What is certain is that the coupling of military conquest with the imposition of a heretical church made the prospect of peace impossible. The next Tudor monarchs, Edward VI and Queen Mary, continued the policy of colonization, introducing plantations, the systematic confiscation of land, and its resettlement with English colonists starting in Lowie and Offaly. This process of land seizure, backed by military might and justified by religious difference, would escalate into the brutal wars of the Elizabethan era, creating the blueprint for centuries of conflict. You realize that the battle for Ireland is no longer about who can be the High King. It's about whose God and whose land laws will survive. The polite fiction of surrender and regrant, Section 12, quickly dissolved under the pressure of religious division and Gaelic pride. The Tudor project to conquer Ireland became a full-blown military campaign during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, a monarch whose primary foreign policy goal was to prevent Catholic powers, particularly Spain, from using Ireland as a back door to invade England. You feel the atmosphere darken. The conquest moves from legal maneuvering to total, protracted warfare, marked by a disturbing level of state-sanctioned brutality. The Elizabethan era saw the escalation of the plantation policy, beginning with the confiscation of land in Munster. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Tudors believed the only way to truly civilize Ireland and ensure its loyalty was to remove the native population and replace them with loyal English settlers. This systematic land seizure provoked a series of major rebellions, culminating in the fiercest and most consequential conflict of the century, the 9 Years' War, 1594 to 1603. The center of this immense rebellion was Ulster, the northern province that had, until now, remained almost entirely independent of English control. The conflict was led by two incredibly powerful and charismatic Gaelic chieftains, Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, and Red Hugh O'Donnell. O'Neill, having learned the art of war from serving the English, was initially viewed as a loyal subject, but chose to turn his military knowledge against the crown, unifying the northern Gaelic clans under a single, potent banner. This was a war for cultural survival and Catholic faith, not just land. The war was a staggering challenge to English power. O'Neill employed tactics of swift guerrilla warfare combined with decisive pitched battles. The rebellion achieved its peak success in 1598 at the Battle of the Yellow Ford, where O'Neill's forces completely decimated an English army. This victory sparked widespread revolts across the entire island, leading to the largest and most expensive military deployment of Elizabeth's reign. You see the Queen sending massive armies, led first by the Earl of Essex, who failed spectacularly, and later by the ruthless and effective Lord Mountjoy. The eventual defeat of O'Neill and O'Donnell was achieved not just through military force, but through a devastating strategy of attrition and scorched earth tactics. Mountjoy systematically destroyed crops and livestock, deliberately starving the population into submission. The climax of the war came not in Ulster, but in Munster. At the Battle of Kinsale in 1601, you picture the scene. The Spanish, finally arriving with a supportive fleet, landed at Kinsale, only to be besieged by the English. O'Neill marched his exhausted army south, attempting a daring pre-dawn surprise attack to relieve the Spanish. The attack failed miserably. The English routed the combined Gaelic-Spanish forces, and the entire Spanish military presence quickly surrendered. The Ulster Plantation, Section 14, had succeeded in creating a loyal Protestant base in the north, but it simultaneously fostered a colossal, deep-seated resentment everywhere else. The island was now a tinderbox, and the spark was provided by the autocratic rule of King Charles I and his ruthlessly efficient Lord Deputy, Thomas Wentworth, later the Earl of Strafford. You are now witnessing the simmering tensions of the 1630s, where the wounds of conquest refused to heal, and a sense of imminent catastrophe pervades the political climate. Wentworth arrived in 1632 with a specific mandate to govern Ireland with a policy he famously called thorough, meaning absolute efficiency in asserting crown power and extracting maximum revenue, regardless of legal niceties or local resistance. This is a mainstream historical fact. Wentworth's administration was designed to make Ireland financially self-sufficient and militarily subservient to the King of England. He achieved this through brutal administrative competence, but alienated every single interest group in Ireland in the process, creating a coalition of discontent that the Tudors had never faced. Firstly, Wentworth aggressively pursued further plantations outside Ulster, most notoriously in Connaught. He declared that the entire province of Connaught belonged to the crown due to an ancient legal technicality, effectively threatening to dispossess every Gaelic and Old English landowner there. When juries refused to validate his claims, daring to stand by the old Brehon law, you remember, he imprisoned them and fined them exorbitant amounts. This action struck fear into the heart of the Old English aristocracy, the descendants of the original Normans, who were Catholic but had always maintained loyalty to the crown. They had hoped their loyalty would protect them. Wentworth taught them that their Catholic faith and their land were ultimately forfeit. Secondly, Wentworth betrayed the Old English aristocracy regarding the graces. These were a series of religious and land concessions King Charles I had promised in exchange for tax subsidies. Wentworth collected the subsidies, but refused to enact the graces, cementing the Old English belief that they could no longer trust the crown. This was a critical turning point. The Old English, who had been the crown's most reliable base against the Gaelic Irish for centuries, were now pushed into common cause with their traditional enemies. Thirdly, Wentworth maintained a highly unpopular Protestant-dominated army known derisively as the Black Army, which was financed through punitive taxes. This army was not only hated by the native Irish and the Old English, but also by the New English, the Protestant settlers, who viewed Wentworth as too authoritarian and too close to the king's Catholicizing tendencies. The political system, strained to the breaking point, finally shattered in England. The escalating conflict between Charles I and the powerful Puritan-dominated English Parliament led to the bishops, wars in Scotland, and the rapid disintegration of royal authority. Wentworth was recalled to England to face Parliament, where he was subsequently executed in 1641 for treason, public spectacle that signaled the collapse of the central government. His execution created an immense power vacuum in Ireland, which the dispossessed Gaelic leaders saw as the final God-given opportunity to strike. Here, as a quirky tidbit, Wentworth tried to fund the King's wars by establishing a royal monopoly on the manufacture of tobacco in Ireland, ensuring that all profits flowed directly to him and the crown. This petty, pervasive attempt to control commerce further fueled resentment among Irish merchants, adding economic grievance to the existing land and religious conflicts. The vacuum left by Wentworth's fall, combined with the king's subsequent need for troops to fight the English Parliament, created intense paranoia on all sides. The Gaelic lords of Ulster feared an imminent, total Protestant land grab. The Old English feared they would be caught between the Protestant Parliament and the king's increasingly desperate Catholic allies. Historians still argue whether the 1641 rebellion was a preemptive strike by the Gaelic leaders, who feared mass extermination, or a purely opportunistic military campaign designed to reverse the Ulster plantation. What is undeniable is that the chaos in England had allowed the resentment, which had been festering since the flight of the Earls, to finally explode into open war. The political and religious pressure built up under Wentworth Section 15 finally detonated on the night of October 23, 1641. The Irish Rebellion of 1641 began as a planned, coordinated rising by the dispossessed Gaelic nobles in Ulster, led by figures like Felim O'Neill. Their initial goal was simple: to seize key castles and plantations and expel the New English and Scottish settlers, all while ostensibly remaining loyal to King Charles I, who they believed would support their Catholic cause against his Puritan Parliament. The plan was ambitious, but the execution was chaotic. While the attempt to seize Dublin Castle failed, the rebellion successfully swept across Ulster, quickly devolving into a general popular rising driven by desperation and a thirst for revenge over decades of land confiscation. You see the immediate, horrific consequences of decades of oppression. The initial phase of the rebellion was marked by widespread, brutal attacks by the native Irish against the Protestant settlers. This is where the narrative becomes fraught with propaganda. While atrocities certainly occurred on both sides, the English Parliament immediately seized upon the reports of settler casualties, which were greatly exaggerated and sensationalized to create a powerful narrative of a Catholic massacre aimed at exterminating all Protestants. This is a mainstream historical fact. The testimonies, often compiled under duress or fabricated, were published as inflammatory propaganda in England, fueling Puritan hatred and justifying future punitive actions. While modern estimates place the true death toll of settlers in the early stages much lower than the contemporary English figures, the perceived atrocity of the massacres irrevocably poisoned Anglo-Irish relations and served as the direct justification for Oliver Cromwell's later invasion. The rebellion spread rapidly. The crucial turning point was the involvement of the Old English Catholic gentry. Remember, these were the descendants of the Normans who were loyal to the crown but alienated by Wentworth. They found themselves caught between the raging Gaelic rebels and the hostile Puritan-dominated government in Dublin. Driven by fear of extermination and a desire to secure religious liberty and their ancestral land rights, they eventually joined the rebellion in 1642. This alliance, the ancient Gaelic aristocracy uniting with the Old English gentry, led to the formation of the Confederate Catholic Association of Ireland, often known as the Kilkenny Confederation, after its base in Kilkenny. This body established a de facto independent government with its own General Assembly, Executive Council, taxation system, and armies. It was a remarkable, if short-lived, act of sovereignty, uniting the two main Catholic traditions on the island for the first time since the Norman invasion. The resulting conflict in Ireland became a complex theater of the larger wars of the three kingdoms, the English Civil War. The Irish Confederates were fighting a four-sided war against the English parliamentarian forces, the fiercest, most ideologically opposed enemies, against the Scottish Covenanter forces, who were entrenched in Ulster, defending the plantation settlers, against the English royalist forces, who, though nominally loyal to the king, often sought control of Irish territory themselves. Internally, the Confederates themselves were divided between the Ulster faction, purely Gaelic, seeking total reversal of all plantations, and the Old English faction seeking a political settlement that preserved their lands and granted Catholic liberties. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Confederates, despite their military strength, were heavily influenced by the papal nuncio, Giovanni Battista Rinuccini, who arrived in 1645 with money and arms from the Pope. Rinuccini's hardline stance, which demanded uncompromising terms for any peace deal that included total Catholic religious dominance, ultimately deepened the internal divisions within the Confederation, preventing them from achieving a decisive, unified political agreement before the arrival of the ultimate enemy. By 1649, the English Civil War was over. King Charles I had been executed by Parliament, and the Puritans, led by the fanatically committed Oliver Cromwell, were masters of England. They saw the Irish conflict not as a political squabble, but as a wicked, bloody rebellion that required divine vengeance. The Confederates' failure to secure an absolute victory or a lasting peace meant that they had invited the final, most brutal chapter of the conquest. The stage is set for the arrival of the English Commonwealth Army ready to inflict the punishment promised, since the exaggerated reports of the 1641 massacres first reached London. The complex, multi-sided conflict of the Confederate Wars, Section 16, was not allowed to peter out. It was brought to a swift, bloody conclusion by the arrival of the ultimate military force, Oliver Cromwell and his new model army, having executed King Charles I and established the Puritan Commonwealth in England. Cromwell viewed the Irish Catholic Confederacy not just as a political foe, but as a wicked, divinely punishable enemy. This is a mainstream historical fact. Cromwell's invasion, beginning in August 1649, was a punitive mission framed by religious zeal and the desire for revenge over the exaggerated reports of the 1641 massacres. Cromwell's campaign was marked by unparalleled brutality and speed, intended to terrorize the population into submission and secure the military base for permanent English rule. The two defining events of this campaign were the sieges of Drogheda, September 1649, and Wexford, October 1649. In both towns, the garrisons, which included Confederate soldiers and Catholic civilians, were massacred after they had surrendered in direct violation of the rules of war. You can picture the horrifying scene. Hundreds of priests and soldiers were slaughtered indiscriminately. Cromwell himself justified these massacres as a righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches, establishing a chilling precedent for extreme violence. These massacres remain potent symbols of English cruelty and religious hatred in Irish memory. The immediate result of Cromwell's terror was the swift collapse of the remaining Confederate and Royalist resistance. Cromwell himself left Ireland in 1650, leaving his generals to complete the conquest, which they did by 1653. The military conquest led to the most radical and devastating act of social engineering in Irish history, the Cromwellian Plantation and the Act for the Settlement of Ireland, 1652. This legislation was designed to completely restructure the ownership of land based on guilt. Those who participated in the 1641 rebellion, the vast majority of the Catholic landowners, were declared traitors. Their lands were confiscated wholesale and redistributed to two main groups: adventurers, those who had funded Cromwell's campaign with the promise of Irish land; Cromwellian soldiers, the veterans of the new model army, paid for their service with Irish estates. The dispossessed Catholic landowners were given a stark choice, famously summarized as to hell or Connaught. They were forcibly transplanted across the River Shannon to the infertile western province of Connaught, where land was scarce and poor. Before the Cromwellian conquest, Catholics owned about 60% of the arable land in Ireland. By 1660, they owned less than 9%. This is the definitive consequence of the Cromwellian terror, the final, virtually complete transfer of land ownership from the native Catholic aristocracy to a new, permanent Protestant settler class. With the military and land questions settled, the post-Cromwellian regime imposed the penal laws. Although some of these laws were passed later in the early 18th century, their spirit and foundation lie in this era of absolute Protestant dominance. You see these laws as the final attempt to destroy the social, political, and economic life of the Catholic majority. They were not merely restrictive, but systemic and existential, effectively treating Catholics as second-class citizens in their own land. The penal laws banned Catholics from holding any political office, including serving in Parliament, banned Catholics from serving in the army or navy, severely restricted their rights to own land. They could not inherit land equally or lease it for long terms, banned Catholics from entering the legal profession, banned Catholics from owning expensive horses, fear of cavalry being raised, prohibited Catholic education, forcing children to seek education abroad or secretly. Here's a quirky tidbit. The laws regarding land were the most insidious. They mandated that when a Catholic landowner died, his estate had to be divided equally among all his sons, unless one of them converted to Protestantism, in which case he inherited the entire estate. This was explicitly designed to destroy Catholic estates over generations and encourage conversion through economic incentive. The fierce winds of conflict that had raged across the island for over 2 decades finally began to subside, leaving behind a landscape profoundly scarred by the arrival of Oliver Cromwell. His campaign, though swift and tragically violent, was intended to be the final, definitive resolution to the long struggle for Irish sovereignty. It was an act of profound, uncompromising will, driven by the conviction that divine judgment necessitated the complete subjugation of the Catholic cause. The massacres at Drogheda and Wexford, but as chilling testimonials to the religious fervor and political finality that animated the Puritan conquest. These events cast a long, dark shadow over the ensuing centuries, solidifying in the collective memory the painful cost of resistance. Following the cessation of hostilities, the focus of the English state shifted from the battlefield to the very foundation of Irish society, the land. Through the Act for the Settlement of Ireland, a vast, unprecedented transfer of property was enacted, designed to permanently dismantle the social power of the native Catholic aristocracy. The resulting Cromwellian plantation saw those who had championed the Confederate cause forcibly relocated to the less fertile territories of Connaught, a sweeping act of displacement that symbolically severed the deep ancestral ties between the people and their soil. This action ensured that a new Protestant landowning class, loyal to the Crown and Parliament, would hold the keys to Ireland's economic future. The ultimate conclusion of this era was the imposition of the penal laws, not as an immediate military decree, but as a slow, corrosive erosion of civil life. These laws were intricate structures of legal disadvantage, designed to marginalize the Catholic majority by limiting their capacity to own land, participate in politics, or even seek education openly. They sought to neutralize the Catholic faith as a political force, transforming it into a private, hidden devotion. Thus, the long, turbulent journey that began with the whispers of the Druids and the rise of the Celtic kings reached a quiet but deeply subjugated conclusion. The island, though conquered, would now begin the arduous, enduring task of survival beneath the grip of a harsh and unyielding legal system, carrying the heavy memory of the Cromwellian terror into the modern age. Good night, sweet dreams.